Hi, everyone. There's still people trickling in, but I think we'll start. I'm Ann Rieselbach, the League's Program Director, and I'd like to welcome you to the first of 2 evenings of lectures by winners of the Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers, as well as the first of 2 receptions in the exhibit following the lectures celebrating their work. To begin with, many thanks are due. Many thanks are due. This program is generously supported by longtime sponsors and architectural enthusiasts, Elise, Jaffe, and Jeffrey Brown, and corporate supporter Tischler and Sohn. League programs are also made possible in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of Governor Andrew Cuomo, and the New York State Legislature, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Support is also provided by the Next Generation Fund and Alumni Fund of the Architectural League's Emerging Voices and League Prize programs. The alumni basically pay it forward to the next generation of winners. We're also incredibly grateful to the Sheila and C. Johnson Design Center of Parsons School of Design at the New School for once again hosting the exhibition and lecture series, and for the guidance provided by their gallery team, Radhika Subramian, Christina Kaufman, Daisy Wong, and Daniel Chu. Thanks also to the Dean Robert Kirkbride, who's here this evening, and staff of the School of Constructed Environments for helping us out with some technical details and storage. And on the League side, I'd also like to thank Matt Ragazzo, who creatively and patiently managed this year's program, and staff members Katerina Flaxman, Lindsay Moreau, Akiva Blander, and Gilbert Santana for their help with the installation and also the upcoming digital content that we're producing. Finally, and most importantly, I'd like to thank the members of the League Prize Committee, Aaron Bessler, Aaron Forrest, Sungu Yang, and all past competition winners. They are all past competition winners. They developed the theme for the competition and the statement, and each year we choose, it's a evolving group of recent winners, and they're the ones who choose the theme because it's something that's meant to respond and resonate with their peers. We don't decide these. If you're wondering how these kind of seemingly arbitrary but resonant themes are chosen each year. And in fact, Erin is going to tell you more about that, but before she comes up, I also want to thank the jurors, and they select the additional jurors to serve alongside them. Sylvia Lavin, Guy Nordenson, Mark Robbins, and Shohei Shigematsu. So Erin, all yours.
Thanks, Anne. Congrats to all the winners this year. It's exciting to be back here. So this year's League Prize theme, Support, looked to an increasingly contemporary situation where precarious forms and precarious social structures are situated beside one another. In discussing the theme, we thought it was interesting that support, even though we might all agree that it's necessary, thinking about the very long list of thanks that Anne just gave. And even though we can all come up with an increasingly long list of associated terms, which might include prop, reinforce, corroborate, frame, tolerate, convey, hold, encourage, and so on, it's rarely the primary site of an architectural project, or at least rarely the thing that has been discussed or positioned in that way for architects. It's often removed, obscured, or relegated to other disciplines, or listed below in finer print. The status of support in architecture today has proliferated so much that its role has been obscured by the many ways that it operates, socially, conceptually, structurally, economically, technically, and also as evidence. And so this year's call for submissions looked for ideas and work that addressed the questions, what does support stand for, and what props up architecture today? So I'm incredibly excited to introduce our first presenter. Kevin Hurst grew up in Richmond, Virginia. He received a Master of Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from the University of Virginia. He's received multiple awards, including the AIA Henry Adams Medal and Best in Show at the Krob Architectural Delineation Competition. He's currently a clinical assistant professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he coordinates studios in the undergraduate architectural program and teaches courses in design, theory, and architectural representation. He founded the Denver-based firm Kevin Hurst Co. in 2009. His work focuses on issues that surround collectivity, democracy, representation, and also the single-family home. Perhaps among the most striking features of his work are the tone and construction, drawing from established rules and regulations, maintaining references and associations, while at the same time creating distance between them. Please welcome Kevin.
Thank you, Erin. That was so nice for you to say that. Great introduction. And hello, everyone. It's so good to be here in front of you, speaking to you. First of all, I wanted to start out, before I say anything, and thank my best friend and partner in life, Carolyn Wilson, who supports and encourages me, even when I'm on the verge of true, unfiltered, unadulterated insanity, which is pretty much all the time. I also want to thank Anne, Matt, Katerina, and Lindsay in particular, but everyone from the league. This award means the world to me. This process of working with you has been incredibly gratifying, so thank you. I want to also thank all of my people back in Colorado who helped me to get here. My department chair at the University of Colorado, Denver, Kat Vlahos, my team, Josh Krell and Wes Kay, and the maniacs at ABC Imaging for jumping on board with my harebrained scheme to spend a week plotting on sheets of watercolor paper. Kenzo Tange once wrote, "People say that the organization man is alone, but even more alone is the man who is separated from this network. We seek inclusion and support from those in our network. It's why I'm here. It is why I sent in a portfolio to be a part of this group. So thank you all for coming." So what does prop up architecture today? On the one hand, to quote Will Toledo of Car Seat Headrest, "I steer clear of graveyards. They are cliche. In my death-obsessed generation, no one should ever have to look at themselves." I couldn't agree more. I sometimes hate to look in the mirror and ponder my work with a critical gaze. But on the other hand, I spend as much time as humanly possible staring at the things that support me and support my beliefs. I seek out the source code of an existence that is both infinitely unique and supremely normative. I search Tumblr for obscure late 70s op art and proto-modern Polish farm structures. I can't help myself. I seek out the of our moment, this late, late moment that feels like molasses pouring off of a spoon. In his 2013 essay, Faster But Slower, Sam Jacob posits that contemporary architecture is severed from the modes, stylistic groupings, and generational iconoclasm of its conventional history. Everything is deflated, he says, collapsed into an indistinguishable pool. This assessment rings true. Increasingly isolated, it is appropriate that we spend so much time talking to ourselves. Our conversations about our work tend toward the unself-consciously pedantic. In hushed tones, we pore over the just remembered images of forgotten late works. We read texts out of context and gleefully appropriate content from other disciplines. We seek out the support of our elders, who we hope might have sponsored our intellectual wanderings. The result, at least for me, is what you see before you. For our exhibition, I put on my Jenks hat and try to map the contextual landscape from which my work emerges. It is not linear. It is not even really particularly Jenksian, or Jenksy, or whatever. It is a narrative field positioning my work together and in the landscape that bears it. This landscape is loosely geographic and distinctly Coloradan, but is indicative of a shallower and less fixed place. It is a body of work as a landscape indistinguishable from its contextual field. One project alone is perhaps engaging, but lacks the support of its colleagues. Each project leads to the next and back again. Unbuilt and rendered, perhaps a bit sarcastically in paper, the work is purely geometric and deeply textural. From this position of staring at everything all at once, I'd like to introduce you to my work and the supporting cast of characters that hold it up. The first project that I'll show you provides a signpost for those that follow it. It is a project that I think will never really be done. It is a project that continues to surprise me in its broad and endless variety. This is incomplete open variations of incomplete open cubes. I love that one. It is an appropriation of Solowitz's variation of incomplete open cubes from 1974. I started here with Saul and with this project because to me it is a truly emblematic of a moment in art history and in human history when everyone seemed to be obsessed with finding the limits and edges of our world. NASA photographed Earth from space. Saul drew all the variations of incomplete open cubes. These things live in the same place. I was looking at Saul's piece and couldn't help but be struck by a sadness about it, but at the same time a true positivity. This is a realm that I'm comfortable with. He, all at once, had determined the mathematical limits of a conceptual problem. No more cubes than this can be drawn. This is our world. And yet, one can't help but want to try to find another. I actually did try to find another. I couldn't find one. I decided to start breaking Saul's rules. I started at first small. I drew and modeled a few hundred cubes. I started simple and easy. But for anyone with the particularly obsessive traits that I have, it can never be so simple. Like Gursky's 99 cent, the infinite and minute variation began to unravel and explode. The realm of possibilities opened up. 120 cubes turned to 1,200 cubes, and eventually, turned into 6,500 cubes. I stopped unceremoniously when I was on a plane to Chicago one night and found myself just cubing it up per the usual. I couldn't help but notice that the person next to me was staring, mouth agape, horrified at a full screen of cubes. She looked rather alarmed, and I took that as a sign that I needed to stop. The project turned out to be rather rich conceptual territory for me. It forced me to leave a somewhat rigid world of geometry that I'd become accustomed to and enter into territory that I hadn't considered. But more importantly, the exercise took on a meaning that to me is relevant to the contemporary moment that I think we are in. Saul's tight, strict set of rules are broken, and for better or for worse, we are in a world of total acceptance, pure prolificacy of open excess. There is no limit to what is possible. It is up to the individual to parse through this cacophony. By stripping the form of meaning, the project generates content without irony. The degree to which form exists in near limitless variety evades our ability to choose a path without attaching meaning. I should note that this project was generated without the use of processing or parametrics. This has always been a theme for me. I built each of these 6,500 cubes myself. I wield labor like an insane and overly time-consumptive tool. For some reason, I take small joy in sitting and drawing cubes for hours on end without exhaustion. I will close this one out with a quote from Andy Warhol that I return to often when thinking of this project. If you want to know all about Andy Warhol, just look at the surface of my paintings and films and me, and there I am. There's nothing behind it. This next project is the first that I undertook in Colorado after moving from Boston. It is a project that I began for a client who is somewhat reclusive and private, but he has been a big sponsor of mine over the past few years. As Wassily Kandinsky once wrote, everything starts from a dot. For me, that dot is very small, and by that I mean it's actually quite large, obsession with informality and ruin being the driving goal. These two images are emblematic to me of this project, the tumbled disorder and stubborn massiveness of a Greek ruin, the hodgepodge of an informal fishing village. Albert Einstein once wrote, "We thus free ourselves from the distasteful conception that the material universe ought to possess something of the nature of a center." I grappled with this rather intensely while working on this house, trite though it may be to pretend to wrestle with Einstein. This notion of a centerless world has since occupied my pursuits. To be able to wander a world that has no center is to search for hierarchy. It is our human nature. The house is separated into two parts. The first and second floor are near mirrors of one another, but rotated and deformed to deal with some minor asymmetries. The first floor is devoted to the day-to-day life of the client. The second floor is made up of a series of detached cabins organized around a stair core. The result is two courtyard schemes stacked atop one another. There's a reason why this project holds an importance to me in my body of work. While working on this house, I made it quite far into documentation and modeling, but unfortunately at an inopportune moment, my computer and backup hard drive were both fried, and I had to begin again from scratch. This is not something that I would recommend. Fortunately, it ultimately led me to a revelation of sorts. In reconstructing what I had built, I began to see that I had been following an intuition without purpose in my first attempts. I had been gleefully composing architecture because I had been starved to do so at this point in my career. I approached this project fresh with a new discipline for geometry and reason when I reconstructed it. It is a house of reason. I could certainly rebuild it a third time, but I don't think that I would ever do that. It evokes to me a line from Tarjei Vesas's poetry. His face was neither handsome nor anything else. It just was. The house's 2 levels are developed in brick and wood, respectively. The stacked courtyard scheme is designed to retain privacy and maximize usable captured outdoor space. The house's organization emerges from a classical purity that I took and mussed up, like tossing about the hair on the head of a well-combed friend's head. The project inherits a fascination with early examples of late modern architecture, like you see here in Lou Kahn's Richards Medical Laboratory and the Afra and Tobias Scarpa House. The Pier box has been made too pure, so pure that it is nearly broken. All that remains is geometry and texture. This next project is a campground. To be more precise, this is a project for a bear-proof campground. Junya Ishigami recently wrote that freeness in architecture is a concept that consumes and absorbs everything like a black hole. His understanding is that our current age not only accepts such possibilities, but also seems to need them. This freedom was a welcome and terrifying feature of my early work. As a fresh start for me, this project needed to break strongly from the stricture of the relentless Bacon House. In meditating on the site, a wooded hillside near Crested Butte, it became clear that there was a permanence to the woods. Rather than building among the trees and jeopardize their health, we began to look at the ground plane as conceptual territory. Here you see Michael Heiser's Munich Depression, which he meticulously photo-documented and displayed in galleries across the West. To the right, you see a still from last year at Marienbad, a narrative subsumed by the presence of the presentation of a medium that is self-aware. The elasticity of the open plain took on a central role for this project. The campground is an elevated plaza suspended among the trees. Its rational surface is at once separated and wholly reliant upon the environment surrounding it, in particular the trees. The platform is characterized by its underside, a concealing network of half-moons hung from the trussed structure to hide the necessary buttressing from the site's trees. The monumentality of the landscape subsumes the scale of any intervention that you bring to it. I had been searching for an approach that could leverage this monumentality without cheapening or undermining it. My research led me to a Kahn quote: "Monumentality is enigmatic, it cannot be intentionally created." My understanding of the landscape's monumentality is rooted in this relentless repetition. I chose to introduce a different but equally ordered repetitive system to the landscape. The circle broken horizontally among a sea of vertical lines, the solid slab seemingly elevated above the field to centralize the disruption of the horizon. The resultant undercroft takes on an eerie and somewhat dangerous quality. The platform does little to formally accommodate the trees that hold it up. As a result, it harkens to Sverre Fenn's Pavilion in Venice, but does so with a lie in its heart. Ultimately, this project served as a moment of liberation for me. At once, I had found a device for responding to the immensity of the Colorado landscape. I had come to a realization that this was a landscape that could not be conquered. It could be destroyed, unfortunately, but not truly conquered. The next 2 projects for me are centered squarely on a territory of work that I believe remains unexplored, at least in the American context, and that's the issue of domesticity. I know it's been explored by a lot of people, but underexplored. To quote Sir Peter Cook, perhaps the answer lies neither in heroics nor tragedy, but in a reemergence of the courage of convictions in architecture. This house, the house on a fence line, questions the nature of elevation in domestic space. The zoning code in Denver has extensive formal restrictions on constructing in space above the ground plane, but says little about how you operate below it. So I began to rephrase my thinking about a particular site in Denver by entirely diminishing my concern for the level of the street. The house on a fence line uses the datum of the acceptable fence height in Denver as a starting point for a reconsideration of a courtyard house typology. The presence of the perimeter of the house is extended from the inhabitable interior area to the exterior. This datum is punctuated by 2 studios, the workspace for the 2 clients who would live and work there. The courtyard is sunken down below the level of the street to create an entirely private series of outdoor spaces that appear to have a much higher perimeter wall on the interior than they do from the street. The 2 studios are periscopes rising up to provide views out, but otherwise the inhabitants' experience is always to look up. Down below the level of the street, the trees take on a magnanimous presence in the site. The ever-present blue Denver sky takes on a primary role. The interiority is similarly focused. A series of broad skylights relieve the unbroken perimeter condition. The house becomes a pavilion always soaking up the sun. The roof plane spans over all the rooms at once, providing a lightness that the low-slung building needs. The house is looking up and not across to its neighbors. The courtyard assumes the primary role of organizing private space. This 6-foot house in a dense urban area raises questions for me about the manipulation of scale, something that I return to over and over again. The house is broad and yet miniature. Its largest scale is found from the inside looking out rather than the outside looking in. To extend this thought on domesticity, we return now to a wooded site near Breckenridge. I took on a project to consider what a duplex shared by 2 families could and should be. This being a remote and flat site surrounded by a heavy copse of trees, issues of monumentality and access to outdoor landscape returned again. On the right here, you see Le Corbusier's apartment for Charles de Bestéguy. On the left, the Vendenhout Kieboom's house by Julian Lampens. I bring this dichotomy up because they, to me, represent similar approaches to domestic scaled space that respond to context through indifference. I don't mean an indifference of not caring. This is a more casual and intentional indifference. To build a white box on a Renaissance apartment building that erases the datum of the city, to construct an entirely open glass house, but put it under an oppressively massive roof. These are projects about sectional imbalance. They use this imbalance to generate privacy and to declare a space as other. The house in a clearing picks up on this notion of imbalance and erasure by stacking 3 unequal levels and obliterating the enclosure around the middle floor. This obliteration is extended in section into the heart of the first floor and the perimeter of the third. The second floor became a stage for viewing the forests, but also for viewing the seat of domestic life. This is a front porch, a back patio, a front deck, a balcony edge, and a courtyard all at once. It is the primary means of circulation. It is the common space that separates the house into 2 separate parts. The house sandwiches 2 domestic private spaces on the 3rd floor and distributes shared communal dining and living space on the partially submerged 1st floor. In this way, the 2nd floor outdoor space is a threshold of constant movement from public to private, an exterior inconvenience that both requires a commitment to move from private bedroom to public dining room, but also ultimately a maximized buffer between these spaces. The resultant volume creates a layered and immersive interiority that holds the exterior at bay through a series of apertures that reveal the surrounding forest in alternating sequence. The private spaces that occupy the third floor are in constant juxtaposition with one another. Like Hayduck's good neighbor house, the two private halves are in constant opposition. You and your neighbor are separated by a tenuous and seemingly artificial boundary. Like Mises' 50-50 house, the balance of emphasis to the surrounding landscape is quadrilaterally symmetrical and preferences a reading of the landscape as an element that is extended into the house. I want to now take you to a more recent project. The monument was originally intended to be a polemical project that commented cheerfully on what I hoped was a nationally triumphant political moment. This triumph will unfortunately not come to pass for at least a few more years. In the crisis of identity that followed, it has gradually returned to its original state. It is quite simply a monument. This is fine. The topic of monumentality to me has always been a rich one. I spoke of it earlier as a contextual condition. I now turn to it as an expression of a social one. Sert, Laguerre, and Gideon once penned, "Every bygone period which shaped a real cultural life had the power and the capacity to create these symbols. Periods which exist for the moment have not been able to create lasting monuments." I take umbrage with this notion. I think we absolutely and intensely live in a period that aspires to cultural life and also enthusiastically lives in the moment, if not the second. But I believe that we have our own sort of monument to build in our own time. It's not a monument that has the permanence of the grandeur of the ancients, but has a sort of tarnished edge, a permanence of its own. The form of the monument arose from a typological amalgamation of three different Euclidean types. The primary formal type, the pyramid, reveals the tectonic of the monument, made up of CMU blocks stacked in an alternating bond and backfilled with dirt. The monument leans in on itself. The second, the line, is a somewhat jagged affair that resolves the monument into two halves. The third, the rectangular slab, is critical for resolving the alternating bond into a stacked one. This becomes the threshold for entering the monument. Inside is a small place for reflection. It is a skylit space made up of plate steel carved out of the block and earth. The space itself is minimally appointed and is resolved through a lateral slice in the tubular extruded plan. This monument is about weight and counterweight. In the case of the Sarah sculpture to the right, the object is an alien structure in the room, pushing out on its confines. In the case of the Charles Ray piece, the man, the wall, and the board are all accomplices to a crime that we cannot fully understand or describe. We know that the man holds the board in place. We know that the board holds the man in place. We know that the wall holds the man and the board in place. But does the man and the board hold the wall in place? Think about it. This is a question that I try to bring to the foreground through this project. What ultimately is the significance of the monument? In our time, I believe that it must exist to hold up that which we share as a high ideal, an ideal that is in jeopardy of passing from memory. This last project is my most recent and kind of fresh in my memory and mind. It was once called the Tall Shed for reasons I can no longer remember. At its heart it is a mother-in-law's house, but in the parlance of our times, it is what is called apparently an accessory dwelling unit. The project plays on a rich history in Denver of load-bearing brick structures. The city was for a solid 40 years a playground for masons, untethered by regulation or preordained design. As such, it is a rich territory for exploring unconventional brick detailing. Here you see a photo documenting the collapse of one of the smokestacks that once inhabited the National Mall in DC. As such, the mother-in-law's house is an amalgam of tectonic strategies. It is a consideration of domestic space at its barest of minimums. The structure is planned for a site with a minimum of floor area allowed, but a 37-foot height allowance. The project was constructed for these drawings brick by brick without the aid of parametrics or algorithms. This was an attempt to prove that the structure could be built by masons, and also insane. The house takes advantage of a regular brick coursing over varying surface geometry to create 4 different zippered brick corners. These zippered brick corners perform structurally to hold the building together while simultaneously breaking the expression of a monolithic mass. I continually returned to simple regulating geometry as both the starting point and the end result for this project. Here you see the minimal accommodations provided, as well as the profiles of the walls that develop thickness sectionally. The end result is as much a question as it is an example, as it is an answer. It is already leading me to new areas of study and future projects that consider a reappropriation of the use of outmoded materials. But more than that, it's a punctuation mark on my consideration of the Colorado landscape and the primary typological study that I've carried out there. I leave you with this closing duo of images and a returning thought on the nature of support in architecture today. We're all trying to grab a hold of where the world of architecture is. We don't have the luxury of an overriding cultural moment that has strong coherence. To me, this is not an issue, but an opportunity. We support each other. We support ourselves, and we keep searching for the context that guides us forward. Thank you.
Okay. Michelle Chang. Oh, sports. No, this one. Okay. Sorry. Michelle Chang is a Wortham Fellow and Assistant Professor at Rice University School of Architecture in Houston, Texas, and is a former McDowell Colony Fellow. She received her Bachelor of Arts from Johns Hopkins University and a Master of Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Her work has been exhibited widely, including at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Toronto. Her practice, which she formed in 2014, works across a range of project sites, including images, software, and built form. Because of this, I think her body of work is incredibly robust and reinforced by its engagement with concepts related to technology, site specificity, contemporary culture, and architectural practice. She focuses on the relationship between architectural conventions and shifts in political and philosophical movements by engaging form in social and cultural situations to create new audiences and new terms for architecture. Please join me in welcoming Michelle.
Really nice. Let's just open this. Okay, thank you to the Architectural League for letting me present today. It's really an honor. Special thanks to Anne and Matt. I don't see Anne, but there you are. It's exciting to be able to show my work, especially to be in such good company. So the projects I'm about to show can be understood as a series of puzzles or convolutions. The 2 designs are an attempt to figure out how representational frameworks describe ideas of space. To me, representational modes are a means of translating an ethos into the built environment. So in other words, picturing is how we cycle between conceptual and perceptual realms. A short video clip will introduce the 2 projects, and in each, linear perspective acts as a foil for alternate ways of imagining the world. In his 1946 essay, which has a very long title, so I threw it up here, Julio Aragon wrote something that I quite like. He wrote, "Perspective is not a constant law, but a moment in the history of the idea of space." What he meant is that perspective is an affinity for situating oneself in the world. I think you could substitute that word perspective for any other representational mode, whether that be parallel projection, raster imagery, or a kind of painting. On that note, here is a video clip. I did this after completing an installation of a half-scale house at Rice University, and my student Amelia Hazinski helped me edit it. I asked 3 children who were 4.5, 5.5, and 6.5, half is really important when you're 4 years old, to describe what was drawn on a series of flashcards by first telling me what they were called, and then also by drawing them. It's loosely based on psychologist Jean Piaget's clinical studies he did in the 1950s. After seeing the kids do several of these drawings, what was interesting is how the children understood the geometry of familiar objects like the cube here in very different ways. So for example, Tilda, who you just saw, who was 4.5, likened the box continuously to this blob with sticks inside. Maria, who's 1 year older, kept leaving off one of the faces of the cube, so it actually resembled something more like an elevational oblique, as if it were sitting on the table. And then Sophie, who is 1.5 years older, drew something more like a perspective and an elevation.
Okay. That's gonna be hard. They like kind, then like that. That.
Pretty good so far.
That. And that. Right? This is hard. That.
Okay.
And then, like, from that side, it looks really weird. Down.
That looks good. Okay.
That's done.
Good job.
Here's a sample of all the cubes drawn by all 3 of the girls. Coincidentally, the characteristics of these drawings align with what Piaget described in his book, The Child's Conception of Space. Without going into too much detail, he found that the children develop according to 3 kinds of geometries, starting with topological to Euclidean and then on to projective geometry. I think the significance of this from a psychological point of view is how these kinds of relationships position subjects within the world. Whereas a topological framework focuses on the singularity of an object and inward-oriented relationships, the framework of a projective geometry is more outward-looking and signals an understanding of how things are positioned with each other in the world. So put broadly, the 3 geometries relate subjects to an objective reality in different ways. So these drastic changes in how children understand space is not just an issue of representation, but it shows how flexible one's conception of the environment can be and how that's revealed through issues of perception. My work is invested in the ties between perception and conception and experiments with pictorial representation to create new environments. The first project, House AB, questions the role of perspective and optics in the process of computer rendering. It looks to specific geometric constraints within the rendering process to design a building. To explain how this works, here's a diagram showing both a conventional 3D view of a box on the bottom and the same cube drawn with a kind of projection used in computer rendering called the perspective transformation. The 2 views are identical in 2D on the picture plane, but distorted formally in 3 dimensions. So that's opposed to the more conventional linear perspective, where the mechanism used to describe the depth and space of the entire environment is the same one that is used to describe the true shapes of things. For example, the fact that the red lines recede to the same vanishing point on the horizon means that these faces in red are also parallel. So perspective is kind of a total package, whereas this other projection defines space in a way that does not retain the true shapes of things. A box in real life, something more like the left versus what I'm talking about, looks very different. Perspective transformation's priority is to construct a scene that looks like a picture. So in many ways, it's more like making a stage set than something in the round. The fact that perspective transformation distorts forms in the computer is probably not all that interesting. Rather, I think its value is in its ability to trace an elasticity of form. I should say that this elasticity of form is a phrase I'm borrowing from Erwin Panofsky in his book Perspective as Symbolic Form. What Panofsky describes is the mental compensation that happens when comparing a perspectival appearance with something that is knowingly false to an objective reality. So for example, the drawing on the top left imagines a field of columns as curved because seeing is understood as a projection onto the backs of our eyes. Knowing that this projection is false may result in the columns being built with entasis or a kind of bulging to overcompensate for this visual error. What's intriguing to me about rendering is that it rigorously defines these overcompensations and uses rules that are based in the fields of optics, psychology, and also art. So House AB takes alternative ways of seeing this box in the design of a single-family house. It was designed by oscillating between perspective and, on the right, perspective transformation. And in doing so, I'm trying to think about representing multiple versions of a single house. This row of diagrams shows the paths of translation from the two modes, like back and forth, up and down. And to test the limits and to start to exaggerate this cube, the model was flickered back many times. The effects of such an apparatus not only distort the three-dimensional form, but when taken in multiples, create different relationships between the objects. So this is a drawing of a single form projected from different views. And you'll see that the relationships between them are quite different. Sometimes they're together, sometimes they're separated. So in developing the design for the house, I took one of these couples and fleshed it out. In the plan, you'll see the new cube. I'm going to try to use this laser pointer. As if it had been looked at twice. So here's one and the other. The area of overlap is the common area, like the dining room, the kitchen up here, or the study and the library. The leftover area outside is more isolated, the bedrooms and the stair, and also an observatory on the third floor. In the sections, I think you can see the doubling a little bit more clearly in the pitch of the roof, here, here, and here. In thinking about the project, and in this rendering especially, I began to test ways to inhabit the image as a means to tie together architecture with its contingent effects. With the help of my research assistant at Rice, Stephanie Lee, this model was continually built and unbuilt to construct a filmic narrative. Rendered shadows are printed onto the model, and lights are projected onto the characters to silhouette relationships between the building and its image. After doing this speculative project, I was given the chance to build a model at a much larger scale. And so here I was interested in investigating similar problems and how the construction of a picture can influence the way we think about architectural form. This here is a photograph of the same house at 1:2 scale. So that's 48 times bigger than the model that you just saw. Here I was looking at the ways image processing tools analyze boundary conditions and different levels of detail in digital images. Specifically, I experimented with something called Blob Detection, which is a popular form-finding tool used in computer vision. Oftentimes, it's used in surveillance and sometimes medical imaging. In this example from the Oxford Active Vision Lab, it's used to find a face in the crowd or a body in the crowd. So I think what's kind of interesting about this is that this tool sets different kinds of background-foreground relationships. In trying to understand the way of seeing set up by this tool, several tests were conducted oftentimes in my apartment, which is what you see here. Yeah. All the pictures are of the same space, under the same lighting conditions, but the borders shift when changing the tool's visual acuity. You could think of this change as the difference between a quick glance of the room and a long look. So changing the resolution of this gaze changes the perception of the boundaries of the space. After doing the research component of the project, I began testing how these definitions of boundaries could play out in creating different spaces within a house. So in building it, I hired a builder, a contractor, John Clark, who you see back there, and also an engineer, Steve Wilkerson from Zia Engineering. And because the house is half scale, all the studs had to get sized down. And it's clad entirely in drywall, which is what gives it that gray papery finish. After John built the insulation, I went back in and used some of the things that I learned with blob detection to start to photograph the piece and to start to think about how that could create a different way of understanding boundaries. The image on the bottom is that same blob detection again. After taking this photograph, I went in and started to add another, I guess, level of specificity or detail by taking newsprint and kind of papering the whole model. So what I was interested in here with the papering as a second step is to create an idea of zoning or areas not based on material coding, like let's say the difference between drywall and wood and carpet, but changing scales and the specificity of a kind of form, domestic form. So you can kind of see the different kinds of folds that I started to put into the insulation. And here's the front view of that same house. It was sliced in half so you could see into it. Here's the view from the top and a view from the side, and I think you can probably tell from the photo that it's pretty rough. It's outside of the scope of the photograph, so it's pretty unadorned here. Whereas when you get closer to where the photograph was taken, there are small details that crop up, like what may be undulations that might be like a floorboard, the nosing of a stair, or something that might seem like a chair rail. The possibility, I think, of using this perceptual framework is that boundaries can be set by architecture's effects, like light and color, as much as material coding. In other words, it takes into account the effects of light and distance in the understanding of form. The second project, this is the last one I'm going to show, called Noise, and it's also what's on display in the gallery out there. Two of my Rice students, City and Two and George Hewitt, helped me put it up last weekend. To set this one up, the image here shows a pattern of a South Indian protective screen known as a column. These patterns are labyrinthian or maze-like. They're purposely designed to be difficult to read, to trap demons in their twists and turns. Here, figural complexity is instrumentalized towards the mental act of entangling, which keeps the viewer stuck in a kind of imaginative state. So what does this topological snare have to do with noise? And how might that be significant in the construction of a built environment? Noise, as I'm using it, is a visual effects filter that introduces randomness into a digital environment, whether it's in its surfaces, lights, or in objects. The filter makes things coming from the computer look or act more natural. It uses mathematically generated images to give surfaces texture, because otherwise they look too perfect and too clean. When that texture is overlaid onto pure geometry, like the cube here, it becomes something like that. The maps simulate the variation in visual complexity found in the real world. Why I think that's significant is because the ethos of this way of working is not towards order, as in, let's say, perspective's mathematical idealization, but towards disorder. Nature and the world at large is understood as messy and random. Here's an image of a specific kind of noise invented in the early 80s. It's used in computer graphics like video games or architectural renderings. to create undulations of ocean waves, maybe ground topography, or even like the texture of a counter. If we look at that same filter at a much smaller scale, you can imagine how it could be used or how it's somewhat reminiscent of small grains of sand or even dirt. In studying all this, I realized what was ostensibly random followed a set of repeatable geometric principles. If you take something regular, like this checkerboard here, and shift the pixels in that checkerboard along a set of irregular curves, like here, the edges between black and white get convoluted, get mixed up, which is basically what noise does. If we take something less abstract, like fruit, this is what happens. You can see how the curves in the previous slides start to appear in the images here and here. In the design process, I was interested in how noise could be used to convolute a set of spaces. Depending on the scale of this filter, what becomes intertwined can operate at an urban scale, so the intertwining of open space and buildings, many buildings, the building scale, or a material scale. This investigation is not only technical and methodological, it also comes from an interest in certain kinds of buildings, let's say from Japan and Switzerland, that employ misalignments and slight asymmetries to create interlocking spaces. Small shifts in the positioning of walls or subtle scalar changes in openings make the building's parts difficult to separate from one another. This is somewhat analogous to the way jigsaw puzzles work, where the formal qualities of parts make them inextricable from a whole picture. So after this research component, I started to design a house with something pretty stable and pure up top, and then added noise to that stable configuration, which is what you see in the bottom. The project looks at how spatial relationships can be affected by the placement of openings and doors, windows and recesses in this way. So here it is. If you look at the plan, applying noise to a regular arrangement produces a series of misalignments and rotations, rendering an approximation of an enfilade plan type. So basically room to room to room. It's not quite an enfilade, but it's a kind of approximation of it. Discrete spaces like the outdoor rooms here and here, the kitchen, the reading room, living room, and bedroom, they're all loosely arranged. The openings between them are contingent on the wall shifts and bends. Similarly, on the second floor, it's fairly loose, and some of the rotations or the shifts in the plan break up the massing on the exterior. This is the roof plan. Those two outdoor rooms, one of them has an opening to the top, and the second, the reading room, has a skylight to below. In the section, you can kind of see what the plan does to the massing. It starts to break up the solidity of it quite a bit. Some of the twists and turns in how you get through the house are resolved through circulation, whether that be a hallway or a winder stair. Here's a closer view of what's going on the stair to get you up to the second bedroom and bathroom. And the massing being broken up, I think, is probably best revealed in the elevations here. It creates a kind of split level. And here's a view of the interior, where you are looking into the reading room, the skylight, and the window, and you can kind of see a view to the stair above. What interests me about noise as a spatial construct is that it creates a kind of complexity that places the spectator in two environments. Like the labyrinthian column, convoluted formal relationships confound immediate visual apprehension. In doing so, they make both the perceivable space in the real world and also the imagined space one inhabits when stuck trying to figure something difficult out. If the processes by which I arrive at these projects seems convoluted, I think it's because the relationships between history, culture, and space embedded within the built environment are somewhat messy. Untangling how they work together is my way of imagining alternatives to those constructs. Thank you.
Okay. This is our final presentation of the evening. Molly Honker and Greg Corso are co-captains of Sports, a design and research collaborative formed in 2010 and currently based in Syracuse, New York. Molly was raised in Wyoming and received a Bachelor of Arts from Dartmouth College and a Master of Architecture from UCLA. In 2014, she was awarded the inaugural Douglas Garofalo Fellowship from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and she is currently an assistant professor at Syracuse University School of Architecture. Greg was born and raised in California and received his Bachelor of Arts and Master of Architecture from UCLA. He is a McDowell Colony Fellow and is currently assistant professor at Syracuse University School of Architecture. Sports has received numerous awards. Most recently, in 2016, they won the Adrian Smith Prize for the Ragdale Ring competition, where they constructed the Project Rounds, which is also awarded a Best of Design award from the Architect's newspaper. And their recent Project Runway won the Museum of Contemporary Art Santa Barbara Take Part Make Art Pavilion competition and is installed as a traveling urban installation moving to sites in various neighborhoods around Santa Barbara. Their work has an intensity which is formally engaged and seriously playful, and reinforced by conflating the knowledge sets latent in craft and the aesthetic category of cute, with the expertise and procedures of high-tech and bespoke. Please welcome Molly and Greg of Sports.
Thanks, Erin. First we'd like to thank the ARC League, like our colleagues, for this really great honor. It's really terrific to be here, especially among these other winners who've been really terrific to get to know better this week. And we greatly appreciate everyone involved in the prize and the exhibition, so thank you all very much. We'd also like to thank our families who are here tonight, which is really special for us. Okay, so when considering the topic of this year's theme for our prize submission, we were thinking of support as an ideological proposition, so where one champions or cheers for a specific type of solution, a legacy, or a kind of camp of thought, much like one supports a particular team. However, sometimes that kind of support runs parallel to the uncritical, rooting for something out of tradition or status quo when it no longer possesses the merits to be rooted on.
So the work and research of our studio, in a way, intends to reject the inertia of support in favor of a more malleable form of operating. Rather than supporting a particular team, we are compelled by smart plays, clever game plans, and the sort of edge or boundaries of the rules, however those are explored, similar to these gentlemen at the All-Star game. And given this, our projects have been preoccupied with an elasticity of the built environment and the various ways in which the ordinary and the extraordinary intersect. For us, the flickering between these states encourages multiplicity, novelty, and discovery, and potentially new forms of engagement. How does the world of objects, sites, images, and behaviors alternate between the functional and infrastructural on one hand, and the awkward and the poetic on the other? And by leveraging a breadth of cultural and physical conditions, the projects we'll show tonight hope to discover discrete but other uses of space, material, and site. And so for the exhibition and in the gallery and tonight's lecture, we selected 3 projects that demonstrate these ideas and consider how the assets of the built environment may be repositioned or re-examined in a multitude of ways.
So the possibility of flickering between different states of understanding or legibility within a specific context, so let's say like familiar and unfamiliar, became a really interesting investigation for this first project we'll show, which is an installation we developed for a gallery on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood. So the context here is super interesting and super charged because of the heavy significance of the ground plane. So this ground is clearly a constructed one, both literally constructed as a piece of infrastructure upon which people walk, but also territorially constructed as a collection of mini sites that each have a specific reference and value. So this ground performs in a variety of different ways. So we see the ground implicated explicitly as a cultural spectacle and social magnet, but also as a site of remembrance or symbol of significance, and even further as a site of protest or activism. So the intention with our project was to leverage the significance of this ground plane, the value and interest and literal attention of the Walk of Fame, and extend it into the gallery, but tweaking it a little bit into something new and unfamiliar in that process. So there's a contextual and material friction that is instigated by coupling the spectacular quality of Hollywood with a foreign to that particular context sense of the ordinary, in this case through material. So at the gallery threshold, the ground material shifts from charcoal terrazzo, which is the material of the Walk of Fame, to an ordinary and ubiquitous in Southern California terracotta tile, which was rejected stock from a local tile manufacturer due to nearly invisible imperfections in the clay surface.
And by deploying the tile on a kind of unfamiliar floor surface form, what materializes here is a visual and experiential environment of which the spectacular quality of the Walk of Fame and Hollywood Boulevard meets the familiarity of the domestic palate. So you can see here the recrafting of the ground plane and how it starts to introduce more spatial qualities and a new atmosphere to the gallery. Our intention was to make the floor look as ordinary as possible, while bit by bit defamiliarizing it through the incremental lifting of the tiles, and generating the effect of the ground beginning to hover and become three-dimensional. And to further degree embedded within the new ground plane, there's a compelling contrast between the imperfect and mundane material and the digital and controlled topography of the surface. In terms of construction, the project uses acrylic rods to elevate the tiles from the gallery floor, which have the quality of diffusing light along the undersides of the tile surface. The resulting landscape generates an atmospheric quality and an artificial presence within the gallery and also back into the street. Even with all the tourists coming to the Walk of Fame during the day, the sidewalk in front of the gallery may actually see more pedestrian traffic at night than during the day. And it was important for us for the project's audience was just as much the drunk club goers at night as it was the designers who might visit the gallery during the day. So at night, the project performs at the scale of the neighborhood when it glows, kind of re-engaging with the neon and brightness and that type of fabric of Hollywood Boulevard, becoming an extension of that context.
So we've recently had the opportunity to work on a few slightly larger scaled projects, and in them we've had this opportunity to couple a more rigorous exploration of the qualities of this installation, so ideas of material and form, with a more complex notion of function, use, and behavior. So architecture can, of course, reinforce common uses of behavior and common uses or behaviors and be made increasingly efficient to host those specific uses. In turn, an alternate behavior can transgress architectural function such that the varied relationships between form and function, between space and activity, has the power to challenge our understanding of what is a normal use of a space or object. It's interesting to think about how we might misuse or hack the understood functionality of a common object like a chair in order to produce something new or different or unfamiliar. So though this particular essay by Bruno Munari is making a functionalist argument, the images also bring up an idea of sort of misuse or misbehavior as something that celebrates the creativity or play of the user. So for instance, stairs and railings in the urban environment are constantly misused by skateboarders, so much so that this architectural or urban form has become a normalized form in designed skate parks, despite the fact that these new environments have no use for the original function of the formal element. So the urban form that had a specific purpose is appropriated into a new setting for a completely different use, which sets up a new normalized condition of misbehavior or counter behavior. So we might understand these ideas of misuse as being one way in which design can kind of make familiar things strange. And another way, of course, is defamiliarization of form and or aesthetic, like this piece of furniture by Jürgen Bay-Verdrug, which asks us to rethink what these objects are, how we engage with them, and how in turn that redefines their use.
And our project for the Ragdale Foundation blends these approaches together and looks at a specific form that is tied directly to specific ideas of function, yet no right way to use it. There's a weird elevated usefulness in the project that emerges out of an unspecified function, a kind of precise ambiguity or specific vagueness. And the features within the overall form were specifically designed to the scale of the human body and the variety of ways in which a body can engage with the surface. The project is a performance pavilion that learns from the history of theaters in the round, which historically bring the performers into the same space as the audience, allowing for a more dynamic and blurrier relationship between stage and seating and between performer and viewer. The project is round in plan and therefore has no front, back, or side. Through its multiplicity of surface undulation types, sizes, and lack of specific hierarchy, the project encourages a variety of performance types, performer-to-audience relationships, stage arrangements, and seating organizations. Small-scale undulations in the ring surface act as seating for viewers during performances or artists to contemplate work during the non-performance times. Mid-scale undulations in the surface provide entrances to the inner space of the ring while also providing a small space for protected stage areas. And the largest undulation is potentially designed as the main stage area and a stage that can be broken down into smaller parts and distributed around the ring for several concurrent performances.
So depending on how the performance is staged and organized, which was done by a set of guest curators over the course of the summer, the formal articulations of the project take on a different implied use. So for instance, when a performance is sited on the main stage, as you see here, the low parts of the ring are implied seating, while the mid-scale undulations are implied entrances to the inner space of the ring. When another type of performance takes place, these identities shift, destabilizing the quote-unquote function. So those sitting, laying, and napping were some of the ways in which we anticipated audience members and resident artists engaging with the ring over the course of the summer. We were really interested to see how the performers would further engage with the surface, not misusing in this case because their project has no clearly defined use, but activating maybe a broader understanding of use or a kind of in-between understanding of use. So Jessica Cornish, who you see here, was a fellow at Ragdale shortly after the project was completed, and over the course of the summer, she utilized the project in a series of performances. This is an excerpt from one such performance in which she engages with the project in, let's say, an unusual and less obvious way than the average visitor might, which for us realizes certain programmatic potentials for the project.
And the physical nature of her engagement hints at an interest in the tactile quality of the surface. And so we wanted to find a conventional finishing material that could perform in a unique way in service of the playful vocabulary of the project. So by using a version of rubberized stucco, we took a seemingly rigid and routine building material look and generated both a tactile and visual softness to the project. So the continuous and grippy qualities that come from that help to reinforce the overall goals, programmatic goals of being able to wander, explore, and inhabit all areas of the project. Similarly, we looked at degrees of contrast and playfulness in how objects sit in the natural landscape, whether that as a serious and legible architectural construct or as a playful and witty proposition. So the color choice, which was called Mint Parfait, was intended to create a sort of low contrast relationship between the pavilion and the vegetation in the context, but also reinforce the kind of lighthearted character and nature of the project. And so it became something that was both distanced itself from the site, but at the same time kind of blending in with it.
And in further considering how an architectural project can kind of flicker between those states, so the kind of blending in into a particular context and also vibrantly asserting itself sort of against it. We recently developed a pavilion for the Museum of Contemporary Art Santa Barbara. And what was interesting to us about this region is the air of Santa Barbara, much like the rest of Southern California. It's super visible, so caused by heat and beach fog, it sort of changes the way that buildings and other objects in the urban fabric and the landscape look by erasing their edges. So here we were interested in envisioning a pavilion as a collection of objects whose physicality could be blurred into the air of the sort of context, while also sort of popping out from it.
And we tested this representation of blurriness and this haziness through a series of elevational drawings that we were developing while we were developing the geometries and the relationships of the actual architectural objects. We tested the line weights, thickness, and angle and overlap to create drawings that at once held the object's edge, but at the same time sort of blurred it. And so to establish a material strategy that operated like these drawings, we knew we needed to develop a porous volume where the blur and registration of that geometry was produced by constructing them from many elements. So the project is made out of thousands of brightly colored steel rods that develop this saturated haze individually and even further in overlap with one another. So just as in the drawings, we were interested in the effect that at once reinforced and dissolved the geometries of the individual pieces, destabilizing the solidity and clarity of a single shape in favor instead of this kind of haze. The project in part is an initiative for the Museum of Contemporary Art and will be installed in a variety of different locations over this current year. And it's intended to host a number of community arts events and serve as a visual landmark for this initiative. And as much as we were interested in this aesthetic quality of the project and its surroundings with each new location, we were also interested in how it could instigate new relationships or new activities given the change in orientation and context.
So back to Munari for a second. So a chair on its side, for instance, loses the exact use that it had when it was oriented in its original fashion, but perhaps it has developed new or unfamiliar uses and effects. And beyond the change of use suggested by such a clear orientation shift like that, we also considered ideas of flexible use or cross-programming, like in this coffee table skirt by Hussein Chalayan. Here there's an embedded alternate use just waiting to be activated in such a case as one suddenly needs a new garment when lounging in the living room. Though in a different way than Munari's chair, this too suggests new use through alternate orientation. So the multiple objects of the pavilion, of which there are 3, each have simple, self-similar geometries and have a number of different possible orientations. So in some orientations, the object can act as a dappled shade structure, while in other orientations, it could act as something akin to a wall, a bench, a loungescape, or a performance stage. Due to the fact that the pavilion is not a single thing, but rather made of multiple pieces, the organizational principles that relate to the collection are also critical to the understood use, as ambiguous as the use may be. So furniture layouts of the architectural interior from the 19th century have been great examples for us for the kind of varied relationships of the collection. So how the configuration of chairs, sofas, tables, rugs, lamps, etc. define specific rooms, style of those rooms, and their use. Program and function of the space then is understood as being defined by the local conditions produced by the collection of objects, organization, and arrangement within the space. And in fact, there have been hundreds of books and magazines published over the last century that offer advice about how best to arrange these elements for a particular end goal. So to cut the length of a narrow, long room, like you see here, or any number of other socio-spatial desires. And at a smaller scale, we can see some of the same characteristics in the object collections of Charles and Ray Eames. Though perhaps not overtly useful, the Eames use the term functional decoration to describe these carefully composed collections of disparate objects, the aesthetic being one of addition, juxtaposition, and composition.
Susan Stewart in her book On Longing argues that the collection is not constructed by its elements, rather it comes to exist by means of its principles of organization. So by combining the idea of shifting orientations and of individual artifacts with the changing organization and arrangements of the collection, our pavilion develops a renewed spatial and visual identity and different use in each new site of which it moves to. Ultimately acting as a sort of urban exhibition as a whole, the project is intended to decorate the various landscapes of Santa Barbara in new ways and as a new icon in each new site. So this is the first site, which is the Santa Barbara Pier, and the context is kind of touristic and heavily embedded with kind of commercial and spectacle. The next site is Estero Park, which was a residential neighborhood near the university. And this is its current This is its current site, which is Ellings Park, and here it's kind of a natural landscape and recreation area for different users. So as the project shifts from site to site and the orientations change, their associated uses are different, their display is different, their visual experience of the material overlap is different, and it brings a temporary unique identity to the different neighborhoods as it moves. So through this quality, we can understand the pavilion's role as a collection of cultural infrastructure, a spectacle that temporarily offers a new space and a new aesthetic in an existing neighborhood for a variety of new and unfamiliar urban activities and visual experiences. And it's been really interesting to see that play out through social media. So these are just a few of the kind of Instagram images that highlight some of the activity of the pavilion that the pavilion is either instigated or kind of served as a backdrop for. So selfies, yoga, games, date night, and a variety of other activities.
And the spectacle of the objects themselves is heightened also by the fact that the project is sort of popping around the city from site to site about once a month. So this is what the project looks like in transit through Santa Barbara, and then being craned into the site. So the fact that this is continuously happening actually plays a really important role in the presence of the project in the city and how it engages with the various communities. So in order to capture that quality of spectacle of the pavilion and also to be true to the conceptual origin of architecturalizing the Santa Barbara air, we actually hired a photographer whose expertise is wildlife and landscape photography. So we were super interested to see how someone whose attention was already honed to, for example, the way fog appears and disappears along a mountain ridge or something, might actually see the pavilion differently than the typical architectural photographer. So maybe he would actually see it as a kind of air rather than as an architectural object. Since the project is temporary, as are the others that we've shown today, these representations will be the only lasting artifact. So rather than simply to document, for us it's interesting to try and produce these sort of final representations that actually continue to push the notions of sort of flickering between multiple states of understanding that we've spoken about today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Hopefully, everybody can join us in the gallery for the reception and to see the work.